Okay, so moving on in some of the specifics of working with an adolescent or a child in a crisis or trauma situation. The second thing is that we're going to want to give them permission to process and to grieve in a way that's meaningful to them. Now, of course, this is true with all of the clients that we work with, whether they're in a crisis and trauma situation or they're just going through life and they've come to see us for other issues. But it's especially important with children and adolescents to do this because oftentimes they feel either a spoken or an unspoken pressure from adults that they need to grieve in a specific way or a specific timeline or be over it by a certain time. So in this therapeutic process, we need to allow them permission to be able to work through it at their own speed. For instance, I have a family that I've worked with, and there's 3 children. They are my primary clients, ages 8, 12, and 16. And they have recently gone through a divorce. Their parents have, I'm sorry. So the divorce was final in 2012, and the parents had been separated for approximately a year before that. So here we are roughly 18 months later, and the mother has brought them in and is uncertain why they're still dealing with the effects of the divorce. She felt like the separation had given them enough time to build a process, that mom and dad weren't getting back together, and then once the divorce was final, nothing really changed for the kids. They continued going back and forth between mom and dad's house. However, what she's failing to realize is that her kids need to process that in a different way. She's been able to move on and only has needed to really process through her own stuff, and her kids have a different way of dealing with that. So when I approached her and I said, hey, it sounds like your kids are still kind of dealing with the shock of just that initial, we're getting divorced, she had a very hard time understanding why that would be the case even 18 months later. And in fact, initially she told me, I can't talk about this with my kids anymore. I've explained it over and over and over, and if they can't get it, then I'm done. I can't do anything else. So in that, as a therapist, then we need to work through that and go, well, what's it like to be the child? Is it possible that maybe they took this differently, or they dealt with it in a different way and now they're feeling the repercussions of it? What's your role as a parent in that? So it just kind of shifts the dynamics a lot when we're working with kids and adolescents, because we as adults have a different way of demonstrating resiliency, of being able to process some of those things. The other thing with that is, as a therapist, it is not our job to help clients pretend the event didn't happen, or to minimize it. Oh, it's really not that bad, or it's not going to be so bad, or when you grow up, you're going to look back at this time and you're not going to think it's that big of a deal. What that does is it discredits their experience. It shows them that what's going on in my life is not that important, and that is almost another crisis or traumatic moment that we're piling on top of that. To tell them that their trauma isn't so bad actually could be another trauma in and of itself. So we want to be very, very careful that we don't minimize what they're going through. What they're going through is a very big and traumatic experience to them at that moment. And so we need to just give them permission to process through that in that meaningful way to them. Also, this is kind of a side note, especially for adolescents and children who have maybe experienced abuse, whether that's physical abuse or sexual abuse specifically. In that therapeutic process, we need to make sure that we are giving them safe ways to experience physical touch and emotions. If you think about a child who has been physically or sexually abused, anything physical touch-wise that is normal or appropriate can come off as being very, very scary. So you think about it, a little girl who might have been sexually abused by somebody, maybe not her father, but maybe an uncle or a stepfather or something like that, who has now experienced physical touch to mean something sexual rather than the appropriate affection that it needs to mean. So when we work with a client like that, it might be very frustrating for their caregivers to go, why won't this child let me hug them? Why do they kind of shudder or freeze up when I try to be physically affectionate with them in an appropriate way? Well, in that, the child has already learned that physical touch means sexual pleasure for somebody else and sexual discomfort for them. So, what we can do as therapists is work with the family, work with the adolescent to develop healthy ways of physical touch. So maybe a hug doesn't feel right to the child at this point, but maybe a high five does. Maybe a secret handshake that is very special between the caregiver and them that equates the affection of a hug, but maybe the child or adolescent just isn't ready to hug that person yet or to allow somebody else into their space. But a handshake would feel very appropriate and very safe. So our job then is to help the family and to help the client identify other ways that they can experience some of that safe physical touch without feeling violated.